But why was it so important to the Jesuits to create a nation? In his book, A Constitutional View of the Law of the Late War Between the States, Alexander Stephens tells us why.
In Volume 2, Alexander Stephens tells us on page 650 the real reason of the 14th Amendment. Quote, consolidation and empire. That's the purpose of the amendment. Consolidation of the states and empire. That's why I call it the Pope's Holy Roman 14th Amendment, corporate fascist, socialist, communist empire created by this 14th Amendment. He goes on and says, they have not as yet openly denied the federative character of the government. However, in direct war upon its principles, their acts have been covertly aimed. This is an exceedingly important fact to be specifically noted and kept in mind. These monstrous reconstruction measures, with all their enormities and fatal tendencies towards ultimate complete centralism and empire, are still based upon the assumption that the states, as separate integral parts, constitute members of what is still, in words at least, acknowledged to be a federal union. All these bold usurpations of power are, upon their face, nothing but resorts to induce or to compel under duress the peoples of the several southern states to go through the forms of adopting the 14th Amendment as an additional article to the Constitution. So, he then concludes, no system of representative government can be long maintained by any people who have not the intelligence to understand it, the patriotism to approve it, and the virtue to maintain inviolate both its form and principles as established. So this is the reason for the 14th Amendment. Consolidation and empire. And this is what Andrew Johnson understood was the purpose, and so he campaigned against it. And he called Lee a hero if that was the real reason for this war, to keep this consolidation and empire from being formed. The 14th Amendment was proclaimed ratified on July 28, 1868. That was the end of the Washington's Republic as established in 1787. So our white Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, and Baptist Calvinist Federal Republic of these United States lasted from 1787 to 1868. And a new nation was established in 1868, and that is called the American Empire in my book, and it has existed from 1868 to the present. And it is squarely in the hands of the papacy for two reasons. For destroying heretics, liberals, perfidious Jews, and infidel Muslims and Buddhists over the last 100 years since the Spanish-American War, or since really the Indian War of the Great Plains. The War of the Great Plains from 1860 to 1890 was the annihilation of the Native American Indians so that they could build an empire from sea to shining sea. A terrible crime. And it was all led by a Roman Catholic Army general named Philip Sheridan, who was advised by America's most powerful Western Jesuit at the time, Pierre de Smet. And it was this Philip Sheridan who said, the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
With the 14th Amendment, the Constitution of the Founding Fathers was tossed into the dustbin of history, and centralization of power in Washington, D.C. was well underway. Now the American Empire could begin in earnest. The American states, both in the North and South, would be subservient to the federal government and would be essentially slaves to this new master. In rapid succession, the United States found itself in one war after another. The Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, and a host of smaller police actions, such as in Somalia, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Libya. Looking over the last 150 years, one can discern the influence of the Jesuits in the initiation of these wars and conflicts for the purpose of building a world empire under their control. Early in the 20th century, the Jesuits were determined to start a new European war.
Germany expelled the Jesuits in 1872. Russia had expelled the Jesuits in 1820. France had expelled the Jesuits in 1880. Britain had formally, although not in actuality, had formally expelled the Jesuits in 1829. Every country in Europe, Switzerland, 1848, every country in Europe had expelled the Jesuits except Belgium. And so the Jesuits said, well, now we're going to have to punish these people because they obviously didn't learn the lesson with Napoleon Bonaparte. So what we're going to do is we're going to use Britain and we're going to use America, and we're going to have a second 30 Years' War. The first one was from 1618 to 1648. The second one's going to be from 1914 to 1945. We're going to have World War I. We're going to have the Bolshevik Revolution. We're going to have the Spanish Civil War. We're going to have World War II. We're going to just have continual war for 30 years, and we're going to control all the factions. We're going to control the Allies, and we're going to control the Axis.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the spark that ignited the First World War. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne. His inclusive policy towards the Slavic peoples and lenient treatment of Orthodox Christian Serbia made him unacceptable to Rome. He therefore could not be allowed to rule. The assassination was set for July 26, 1914. Since the year 1054, the Catholic Church has been waging war against Orthodox Christians. The Orthodox Christians did not accept the supremacy of the Pope. A war involving the major powers of Europe would be a perfect opportunity to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Orthodox Serbs and Russians killed. Afterwards, Rome would be in a better position to dominate these countries. Who shot the Archduke? Gavrilo Princip, a member of the secret society called the Black Hand. The Black Hand was founded by Freemasons. During the trial, Princip testified that his colleague, Saganovich, told me he was a Freemason, and on another occasion told me that the heir apparent, Franz Ferdinand, had been condemned to death by a Freemason's lodge. Even though a Masonic group carried out the murder, all of Serbia was blamed. It was never pointed out at that time that the assassins were linked to Freemasonry, and that its upper levels had been under the control of the Jesuits for nearly a century. After World War I, a movement was put in motion to have a world government that would help the nations of the world live in peace. A peace controlled by the Jesuits. When this world government, or League of Nations, failed to materialize, the Jesuits pushed forward plans to create a second world war. Even before the end of World War I, the Jesuits had set in motion a plan to bring the Russian Orthodox Christians back into the fold of the Pope's control. Under the direction of their superior general, Vladimir Ledovchkovsky, the Jesuits instigated the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This revolution brought communism to Russia. The Jesuits had been thrown out of Russia over 100 years earlier, but now the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Lenin, admitted the Jesuits back into Russia in 1922. Lenin proved fickle and showed signs of disloyalty to the Jesuits. For this, he was poisoned, and his replacement, Joseph Stalin, was ready to carry on with the Vatican's bidding. As a boy, Stalin had obtained a scholarship to attend Tiflis Theological Seminary. Openly, the school was Orthodox Christianity, but behind the scene, it was run by the Jesuits. In 1931, Stalin was interviewed by Emil Ludwig. Ludwig, do you not admit that the Jesuits have good points? Stalin, yes. They are systematic and persevering in working to achieve sordid ends, but their principal method is spying, prying, worming their way into people's souls and outraging their feelings. Once in power, Stalin killed millions of people, both Jews and Orthodox Christians. He killed anyone who would resist the new Soviet state he created based on Marxism. What many failed to understand was that Marxism was based on the Jesuit slave plantations, or reducciones, in South America, and Sir Thomas More's book, Utopia.
What the Jesuits did was they were the masters of communism. Communism originates with the Roman Catholic traitor, whose name was Sir Thomas More. Sir Thomas More betrayed King Henry VIII, gave his full allegiance to the Pope, and for which reason Thomas More was executed as a traitor, holding forth the Pope's temporal power over his allegiance to his king. Sir Thomas More is the author of Utopia. Utopia is the foundation for communism. So communism is Romanism. In fact, the orders, the many communities of the Roman Catholic institution, the Jesuit order, the Redemptorist, that goes on, they run on communist principles of universal equality. Communis is the Latin term. So therefore, communism is a brainchild of the Jesuits, but it has been made to look Jewish through implementing it through Marx and his Communist Manifesto, financed also by another Masonic British Freemason, Engels.
Besides establishing communism in Russia after World War I, the Jesuits sought to re-establish the Pope's physical kingdom that had been taken from him in 1871. On June 7, 1929, the Lateran Treaty was ratified, which re-established the Pope's domain called Vatican City. The new Prime Minister of Italy, Benito Mussolini, was instrumental in bringing about the treaty. The treaty occurred only a few months before the economic crash that started in America and quickly spread around the world, called the Great Depression.
Approximately $90 million worth of gold in lira, I think it was about $1 billion worth of lira, something like that, was given to the papacy by the Italian government. So for reparations, for lack of a better word, because we had been suppressed from 1870 to 1929, you owe us all this money. So Benito Mussolini enslaves the Italian Catholic people, makes them pay this huge sum, which they didn't want to pay. And what does the papacy do with this money? Well, this treaty's in about February or March. In October, the Jesuits crashed the American stock market. And they used their number one short seller, the Irish Roman Catholic Joseph P. Kennedy, to do it. So they sell short, the margin calls can't be met, the stock market crashes, and what happens? The Vatican takes their millions of dollars that they got from Mussolini and they invest it in all the corporations and businesses that are busted on Wall Street, and they buy it all for pennies. So by the time Wall Street comes back into power, the Archbishop of New York completely controls all the major corporations in this country.
As banks began to fail, the Federal Reserve did not act to pump money into the system, which it should have done had those in control of it wanted to keep the banks afloat. As the chaos lingered and many lost their jobs and were driven into poverty, the Jesuits created a dictatorship out of the office of the President of the United States. In March 1933, the new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed into law a state of national emergency. Under such a state of emergency, the Constitution was set aside, ostensibly for the public good, until the emergency was canceled by the president. Roosevelt never canceled the emergency. This was verified in 1973 by the Church Matthias Committee and published in Senate Report 93-549. No American president since then has canceled the emergency. And even though Congress passed the National Emergency Termination Act in 1974, this termination was in name only. The reality was that the emergency powers taken were never returned. They continued in the U.S. Code as permanent powers. Thus, we are currently in a state of emergency or dictatorship. It should also be noted that Roosevelt was a 32nd degree Freemason. FDR was obliged to follow the orders of the head of this secret society. His oath to Freemasonry superseded his oath to the U.S. Constitution. And as we have seen, the man in control of Freemasonry was the Jesuit Superior General. In Germany, the Vatican had in place Adolf Hitler. It is usually not emphasized, but Hitler was a Roman Catholic. Hitler praised the Roman Catholic Church, saying that, "Until now, there has never been anything more grandiose on the earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church." Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's head of the SS, was also a Roman Catholic. Friedrich Hofhet wrote, "Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, and most members of the party's old guard were Catholics." After the war, Walter Schellenberg, former head of German counterespionage, stated, "The SS organization had been constituted by Himmler according to the principles of the Jesuit order." Himmler's title as Supreme Commander of the SS was to be the equivalent of the Jesuits' general. Incredibly, although he killed and tortured millions, the Vatican never excommunicated Hitler. In fact, not one of the mass murderers of the Third Reich was ever excommunicated by the Vatican. The day Hitler died, the Spanish dictator Franco, also a Roman Catholic, had this statement run in the publication Reforme. Adolf Hitler, son of the Catholic Church, died while defending Christianity. As a loyal son, Hitler killed heretics, including Protestants, Jews, Orthodox Christians, and even liberal Catholics. All told, the war dead numbered between 62 to 78 million people. Who financed Hitler? The answer is clear and easily verified. The Vatican and many of the wealthy elite in the West gave Hitler the money he needed to build the Third Reich. As early as 1919, Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli met a young Adolf Hitler in Munich. The meeting occurred at night while all the household was asleep except for the nun who attended Archbishop Pacelli. Her name was Pascalina. According to Pascalina, Hitler told Pacelli that he was out to check the spread of aesthetic communism in Munich and elsewhere. It did not come as a surprise to her, therefore, in light of Pacelli's hatred of the Reds, to see the prelate present Hitler with a large cache of church money to aid the rising revolutionary and his small struggling band of anti-communists. "Go, quell the devil's work. Help spread the love of Almighty God," Pacelli told Hitler. "For the love of Almighty God," she heard the young man Adolf Hitler reply. Money for this young revolutionary also came from industrialists in the West.
Hitler's rise to power was financed by London and New York and Berlin. They were the Knights of Malta running the banking institutions of the world.
In the discipline of historical research, one of the greatest taboo subjects is to look into who financed Hitler. The answer is clear and easily verified. The Vatican and many of the wealthy elite in the West gave Hitler the money he needed to build the Third Reich. Many do not realize that Prescott Bush, the grandfather of President George W. Bush, and George Herbert Walker, the maternal great-grandfather of President George W. Bush, were Nazi collaborators. Along with Averell Harriman, they set up Union Banking Corporation as a complex money laundering operation for a number of Nazi front businesses. Documents at the National Archives and the Library of Congress show conclusively that Prescott Bush and George Herbert Walker should have been tried for treason because their Nazi dealings continued after the U.S. entered World War II.
They had continued to do business with their primary Nazi patron, who was Fritz Thyssen, who backed Hitler beginning in 1921 and who was the wealthiest man in Germany, and a steel and coal baron who, with his partner Friedrich Flick, essentially built the Nazi war machine along with I.G. Farben. In 1951, when Fritz Thyssen died in Argentina, Union Banking Corporation was liquidated by the U.S. government, and Prescott Bush received $1.5 million for his holdings in his Nazi business, and that was the beginning of the Bush family fortune for all intents and purposes. George Bush doesn't take his philosophical foundation from the Bible or the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. George Bush takes his inspiration from what he learned in Skull and Bones and from the Thule Society that Hitler and Goebbels and Goring cut their teeth in, Bohemian Grove, these evil organizations that perpetrate the ugly things that these criminals are doing to this country, for which they must be held accountable.
The Jesuits created the Illuminati in 1776. The American branch of the Illuminati was called Skull and Bones and has its headquarters at CIA recruiting ground, Yale University. Prescott Bush was a member, as was his son and grandson, President George W. Bush. It is interesting that in the 2004 presidential election, two Skull and Bones members ran against each other.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go wild.
I'm sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322?
First of all, he's not the nominee. And, look, I look forward...
Are you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us? Not much, because it's a secret. Is there a secret handshake? Is there a secret code? I wish there were something secret I could manifest. 322, secret number? There are all kinds of secrets, Tim, but one thing is not a secret. I disagree with this president's direction.
It is evident that the Bush family and others are under and have been under the control of the Jesuits for decades. Most people are familiar with Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. However, it may surprise many that Hitler did not write the book.
Adolf Hitler was not a writer. Adolf Hitler was a newspaper reader. According to Kurt Kruger's great book, I Was Hitler's Doctor, it was published in 1934, he said that Hitler's lair was just filled with old newspapers, that's all he ever did was read. These old newspapers. He was not a writer. He was not a student of history. He was not a student of culture. If you read Mein Kampf, whoever wrote it knew the cultures of many different countries over many different centuries. They knew all about political practices. The writers of Mein Kampf were brilliant. And Mein Kampf, according to Leo Lehman, who was an Irish Roman Catholic priest, who wrote Behind the Dictators in 1942, said that Father Bernard Stampfel was the real author of Mein Kampf.
Adolf Hitler was created to be an instrument of the Jesuits, and like Napoleon, Hitler served his creator well. Millions of the Vatican's enemies were dead, and America forgot George Washington's warnings and abandoned its policy of isolationism. During World War II, the Vatican targeted the Orthodox Christians in Croatia for destruction. As in World War I, the Orthodox Serbians of Croatia suffered again in World War II. A campaign of terror and murder was inflicted on the Serbs by the Croatian Ustaše regime. The leader of the Ustaše was Ante Pavelić, a Roman Catholic. Pavelić and the Ustaše murdered around 500,000 people, while 250,000 were expelled and another 200,000 were forced to convert to Catholicism. Like the Jewish Holocaust, Pope Pius XII never condemned these atrocities, nor has any pope since then condemned them.